Representative democracy. It was a new way of thinking about democracy, a new type of government in which people, understood as voters faced with genuine choices between at least two alternatives, are free to elect others who then act in defense of their interests, that is, represent them by deciding matters on their behalf. There is no such notion of this in the Athenian world. Much ink and blood, of course, was to be spilled in defining what exactly representation meant, who was entitled to represent whom, and what had to be done when representatives disregarded those whom they were supposed to represent. But common to the second historical phase of democracy was the belief that good government was non-violent government by representation. Often contrasted with monarchy, representative democracy was praised as a way of governing better by openly and non-violently airing differences of opinion, not only among the represented themselves, but also between representatives and those whom they were supposed to represent. Representative government was also hailed for encouraging the rotation of leadership guided by merit. It was said to introduce competition for power that in turn enabled elected representatives to test out their political competence before others. It was an effort, in a way, at internalizing the old Greek custom of ostrakismos, of ostracizing potential demagogues. Representative democracy internalized that mechanism through the rotation of leadership through periodic elections. The earliest champions of representative democracy also offered a more pragmatic justification of representation. It was seen as the practical expression of a simple reality, that it wasn't feasible for all of the people to be involved all of the time, even if they were so inclined, in the business of government, and that given that reality, the people must delegate the task of government to representatives who are chosen at regular elections. The job of those representatives is to monitor the spending of public money, to make representations on behalf of their constituents to the government and its bureaucracy. Representatives debate issues, make laws, they decide who will govern and how on behalf and in the name of the people. Now, as a way of imagining and handling power, representative democracy was an unusual type of political system. Compared with the previous assembly-based form, of which Athens was one example, it greatly extended the geographic scale of institutions of self-government. As time passed, and despite its localized origins in towns and rural districts and large-scale imperial settings, representative democracy came to be housed mainly within territorial states protected by standing armies and equipped with powers to make and enforce laws and to extract taxes from their subject populations. Representative democracy was equally unusual in that it rested upon written constitutions, independent judiciaries, laws that guaranteed procedures that still play vital roles in the democracies of today. Inventions like habeas corpus, periodic election of candidates to legislatures, limited term holding of political offices, voting by secret ballot, referendum and recall, electoral colleges, competitive political parties, ombudsman, civil society, and civil liberties such as the right to assemble in public and liberty of the press. All of these inventions were unique to the phase mostly of representative democracy, and they were designed to ensure that in matters of politics, the subjects of government would have their heads counted instead of being chopped off by those who governed. This system of representative democracy in territorial state form was, however, vulnerable to violent conflict and war, fueled by struggles for national self-determination. So here I see a deep ambivalence in this second historical phase that seems to me to come to an end around 1950, and I'll try to justify that in just a few moments. But the deep ambivalence has to do with this, that representative democracy represents a period and a cluster of inventions, new inventions, many of which have the effect of democratizing violence. Think of habeas corpus. Think of the call for liberty of the press, unknown, of course, to the Greeks because there was not yet a printing press. The point was to be able to discuss non-violently power. Many of these inventions had these democratizing effects through time. But on the other hand, representative democracy was bound up with a power container, the territorial state, and that power container was wrapped up with a new doctrine invented only during the 18th century, the doctrine of national self-determination. The invention and deployment during that century of this doctrine of the sovereignty of nations was something new, but it proved to be a curse for democracy. The formula seemed to be simple enough and thoroughly consonant with the ideal of representative democracy. Each nation, living within a given territory, was to be entitled to govern itself through its own institutions. As we now see much more clearly in retrospect, the troubles with this doctrine were manifold. Not all people defined themselves primarily or exclusively as members of a nation. Women, trade unionists, others, did not necessarily see it that way. The doctrine implied that they should be forced to do so, that the highest identity was membership and respect for one's nation. Nations, in any case, did not release their passions or procreate or live separately from others in discrete territorial frameworks. There would be no problem if all nations lived discreetly, with no overlap, with no sex, no procreation, no infatuation, no mobility, no problem. But as Eric Hobsbawm has pointed out, that was never the case in Europe, the birthplace of this doctrine of national self-determination, and it therefore meant that the call for national self-determination implied the compulsory demarcation and cleansing of nations from lands where they were said not to belong. This implied, as a last resort, that the doctrine of national self-determination, sounding very democratic, in fact became caught up in the business of murder and violence and war. Now, since self-determining nations living in territorial states resembled atoms without a gravitational force to hold them together, jostling, elbowing, outright fisticuffs were a permanent probability in this system. Let me quote to you Prince von Bulow, who directed German policy as Imperial Chancellor from 1900 to 1909, who put it like this on the eve of World War II. If it were possible, von Bulow wrote, for members of different nationalities with different languages and customs and the intellectual life of a different kind to live side by side in one and the same state, without succumbing to the temptation of each trying to force his own nationality on others, things on earth would look a good deal more peaceful. But it is a law of life and development in history that where two national civilizations meet, they fight for ascendancy. In the struggle between nationalities, one nation is the hammer and the other the anvil. One is the victor and the other the vanquished. Representative democracy was no angel in this general trajectory. The link, in fact, between democracy and nation states and the doctrine of national self-determination was chillingly foreshadowed in the famous 5-minute speech by Robespierre on the subject of virtue and terror to the Convention on February the 5th, 1794. Democracy, he thundered, is a state in which the people, as sovereign, guided by laws of its own making, does for itself all that it can do well, and by its delegates what it cannot. Democracy is the only form of state which all the individuals composing it can truly call their country. Robespierre went on to make a prediction, one that proved as inaccurate as it was arrogant. The French, he said, are the first people in the world to establish a true democracy by calling all men to enjoy equality and the fullness of civil rights. And that, in my opinion, is the real reason why all the tyrants allied against the Republic will be defeated. It was one of the very first bellicose speeches in the history of representative democracy, and it was played out repeatedly in all four corners of the earth thereafter until well into the 20th century, and to some degree it still happens today. Robespierre's boast played, of course, to the high drama of the moment. With one leg in the Convention and the other firmly planted in the revolutionary cells and clubs of Paris, Robespierre clambered to the summit of power by presenting himself as the great reconciler of direct and representative democracy. He was the people. Robespierre turned out to to be, I think, the first democratic dictator of modern times. But he paved the way for something new in the history of democracy. History was soon to repeat itself. Athens versus Melos, but this time on a continental scale. Democracy, French style, went on the march in uniform to get caught up in the practical imperatives of conquest and occupation. Annexation in the name of democratic ideals was either carried out by the French through the signing of a treaty, as for example happened in the Rhineland, or territory was simply annexed and subdivided into arbitrarily defined French-style departments without consultation, as took place in Belgium in 1795 and Piedmont in 1802. It's true that there were places like the Batavian Republic and the Helvetic Republic where the Napoleonic armies claimed that the birth of a sister republic was the work of its most advanced patriots. But in every case, French control over territory, resources, and people was the primary imperative. National self-determination by citizens was arranged on French terms. French armies lived off the land and its people to procure, as far as possible from enemy territory, the supplies necessary to provision the army as well as arms, clothing, equipment, and transport. Huge sums were expected. And it was not long before the search for military resources became the prime purpose of occupation, as when the revolutionaries marched into northern Italy for the purpose of providing a new granary for the French armies and new funding to help pay off the costs of war. Civilians were seen as fair game, and officers, knowing the unreliability of food convoys, turned a blind eye to the bad behavior of their troops, despite the grave risks of military indiscipline. The People's Army hit a bit into the flesh of the peoples they occupied. In the name of ballots, they billeted themselves using bullets. Horses and cattle were rounded up, and the fields were stripped to feed starving battalions. Troops, in the name of democracy, smashed their way into homes, where they helped themselves to money, to bedding, to clothing, to wine, to food, and kitchen utensils. There was drunken abuse, there was wanton vandalism, and beating and rape of anybody who stood in their way. Few troops were ever brought to justice, and little gratitude ever flowed from the conquered. Countless Italians, Belgians, Spanish, and Rhinelanders understandably saw the conquest with the eyes of conquered people. They saw equality bathed in misery, fear, and poverty, but no liberty or fraternity. It bred resentment and resistance, and the consequence, not surprisingly, was that the whole trend towards democracy stalled. In my own attempt to write a new history of democracy, I'm very struck by a paradox, which is that the closer Napoleonic troops came and occupied in the name of democracy, the more a turn-off it was for the local population, so that, paradoxically, a country, an island like Britain, which was untouched by troops, democracy survived. But in Russia, occupied by Napoleonic troops, one can say that the French Revolution and the ideals of democracy permanently damaged the democratic ideals and traditions of Russia until this day. And I think it is this revolution in the name of democracy and the birth of an empire, second time in the history, that is, I think, heavily responsible for the near collapse of parliamentary representative democracy in World War I and its virtual extinction by the spring of 1945. It's a bitter pill that I think one has to swallow. These trends, this growth of a representative democracy, populist, demagogic, in French, imperial form, of course, somehow got involved and was deeply dependent upon revolutions, a revolution in armaments and in the mode of warfare. It is interesting, I have no time to do this, but major transformations in the means and mode and means of warfare seem to me to be associated with various phases of the history of democracy. It's perhaps enough in this context to note that each major historical phase of democracy appears to coincide with a radical transformation of war fighting. The imperial democracy of Athens coincided with the hoplite revolution on land and the massive expansion of trireme power at sea. The struggle for representative democracy, symbolized by Cromwell's Ironsides and the People's Armies of the Napoleonic era, coincided with the organization of machine-like armies equipped with swords and muskets and great killing power, together with cannon-firing warships capable of all-devouring confrontations on the high seas, in which the aim was skillfully to destroy one's opponents and their equipment completely. The widespread implosion of representative democracies in the first decades of the 20th century coincided with the perfection of these trends, I would say, their mutation into something that had never before happened, the invention of overkill weapons systems that were capable of exterminating the whole human species. Now, I see the clock is ticking away, and I'm going to get guillotined or something worse if I carry on. So I will jump to the final part of this lecture. I want to say, as a consequence of these unhappy experiences with representative democracy in territorial state form and the development of overkill weapon systems that eventually took on a global reach, that it's against these trends, symbolized by American B-29s, symbolized by B-52s, symbolized by the invention of intercontinental ballistic missiles and so on. It's against the backdrop of these experiences, two global wars, the Holocaust, mustard gas, barbed wire, aerial bombardment, and so on, that it seems to me that democracy is probably, it's not very well recognized, that democracy is undergoing some kind of mutation in our times. And I would like to date it to roughly 1945. I don't know what to call it, but I'm going to call it post-representative democracy in this lecture. What is striking for me, and has bears centrally on the problem of the democratization of violence that I spoke about, is the invention of a whole set of new institutions that bear on the problem of war and violence. Let me mention some of these that are unique to our times. The growth for the first time on any scale of peace movements that are rooted in civil society. Disarmament initiatives, of which we've not heard the final word. Summits, an invention of World War II and championed strongly by Churchill. They have turned into public gatherings on a global scale. War crimes tribunals, truth and reconciliation commissions, employee co-determination schemes, by the way, the great gift of the British occupying forces to the Germans immediately after 45. Participatory budgeting, and above all, the marriage for the first time in the history of any democracy of human rights and democracy is something new. And I would add, finally, experiments such as that of the EU in the creation of power-sharing institutions and new power monitoring mechanisms like the open method of coordination that cross borders. This, I submit to you, is not simply a third wave of democracy. It's not simply an extension, as Fukuyama would say, of liberal representative democracy. It represents something new, much greater complexity in the monitoring of power. And some of these power monitoring mechanisms cross borders, and quite a few of them have to do with the problem of war. Think of the thousands upon thousands of human rights organizations that specialize in exactly this, in blowing the whistle on unjustified, cruel usages of violence, and many of them, of course, have a complete zero tolerance of that. For this, in this era of post-representative democracy, several other things are new. It's the first time in the history of democracy that the language has become global. The first great breakthrough is, of course, that of India. It is the first time in the history of democracy that ethno-national prejudice and racist views are being slowly extracted from the ideal of democracy. I could cite to you one of the last attempts to write a history of democracy by James Bryce, who, when reflecting on the possibility of representative democracy in Spanish America, says, forget it, because, you know, there are some civilizations and some races that are suited to it and others are not. That kind of thing can't be written today, or if it is, it gets you pretty bad press. I would say as well, it's not very well noticed that one of the effects of this shift that is just beginning towards something like a post-representative democracy, where democracy is no longer constrained by the doctrine of national self-determination and no longer perforce restricted to the territorial state. What's striking for me is the way in which democracy itself is undergoing redefinition. I'm struck by the disappearance of the people from democracy because of the history of bad usages of it. Rather, democracy comes to be seen much more pragmatically as a handy weapon for use against concentrations of unaccountable power and the follies and dangers they beget. In the era of post-representative democracy, the word democracy comes, I think, to have this new meaning: non-violent public accountability and public control of decision makers, whether they operate in the field of state or interstate institutions, or as well within so-called non-governmental or civil society organizations such as businesses, trade unions, sports associations, and charities. So the passing away of the people. It's true that some still use it. In China, the recent white paper goes on at length about the sovereignty of the people. In my experience, those who speak the language still of the people are typically democracy unfriendly. It's a great paradox, but we should note it. I think it's worth, however, drawing this to the key point that I want to make, because there is one other development in our times, something new in the post-45 period, strikingly evident after 1989, which is that it is under the shadow of a new empire of the United States that these innovations are taking place, that this globalization of language and the mutation of democratic ideals is taking place. Now, I don't want to give a political speech about this, and you've heard enough against the United States, probably, as we have in the United Kingdom. It's hardly possible anymore to speak a kind word about the United States, so please forgive me for adding to this, but I want to suggest to you that we are living in times where there is a third empire, a third democratic empire. It is an unusual empire or dominant power, to be sure. It's the first global empire in a way that Pax Britannica never was. The Brits kept out of, for example, militarily parts of South America and out of Central Europe for reasons of, self-reflexively, of the dangers of overstretch. They did it through markets and other means. This is the first time that a dominant power can operate in all four corners of the earth. It's the first global empire. In hard power terms, you know the figures well. The United States has over 1 million troops, men and women stationed on 5 continents in over 100 countries. It's the world's biggest, most dynamic, most innovative and aggressive weapons manufacturer. It had been expected that by 2007, military spending of the United States would equal the rest of the world combined, but that line was already passed in 2005. The United States is, of course, also through soft power forms imperial. It's the driving force of the emergent global civil society. It's the heartland of the telecoms industry. It was the global champion of consumer ways of life. And in short, the United States is a dominant power that has the proven ability to act as a vigilante or rogue power if it wants. It can act tough, as we know from recent years. It can act tough in all kinds of ways. But the United States is a dominant power that is unusual in one other sense. All dominant powers, all empires, spoke of themselves in universalistic terms. For example, Henry V dreamed of a reunited Christendom in the glorious final crusade against the Turk. This one, the United States, stands on the same continuum, except I think it is a more awkward empire. Awkward because it champions the first ever version of the need to spread democracy to all 4 corners of the earth in a manner and with a fervor that British imperialists would have found strange. By justifying all that it does in the name of democracy, including the launching of war on its enemies, arguably the United States has now put the norms and institutions of democracy on trial. I'm going to top this by saying crudely a few final things. What are we to make of these trends and this language? It's true that the United States has a proven track record of defending and creating democratic institutions. The rescue of parliamentary democracy in Britain during World War II, the post-45 hothousing of forms of democracy in the Philippines, Japan, and Germany are the most commonly cited examples. So why should we not just sit back and relax, make ourselves comfortable in the seat of presumption that American imperial power will do for democracy what some previous empires did? That in our times it's on balance good for democracy, its guarantor, its best hope, its savior in the face of pushback, which is the new term that comes from Washington as of 7 or 8 weeks ago. Democratic pushback. I think there are several reasons why we shouldn't sit back in the chair of presumption about these things. The Carnegie Endowment key study shows most forced regime changes championed by the United States have not ended in democratization. They have failed, 3/4 of them. There is also the danger, I think, very grave danger, that against these trends towards post-representative, much more complex democratic monitoring that I've spoken of, the United States has become attached to a very reductionist understanding of democracy. Principally, you do it top-down, you handpick political elites, you get a constitution in place, you have your first elections, and you hold your breath and you hope that it seeps downwards, that those democratizing trends seep downwards. If you speak to Paddy Ashdown, the former UN High Commissioner in Bosnia, he tells you it's complete foolishness, that you have to do it from the bottom up. But that is another story. There is also another reason for being on our guard, which is that there is a great danger. It was Hannah Arendt's warning that hypocrisy is the great enemy of democracy, that things can be done in the name of democracy that are quite at odds with its norms, that even the American talk of democracy might well turn out, the historians will tell us, to be maquillage, to be a mask for violent power maneuvers that have little or anything to do with democracy. So what is to be done? Is it possible that the United States has, as an empire, as a democratic empire, has reached its moment of hubris? I do not know. I have in mind here the question that was asked by John Hobson at the end of the 19th century about the British Empire. He proved to be right. There comes a moment, typically in empires, of hubris, where things go pear-shaped because the internal learning processes are weakened, and aggrandizement and self-aggrandizement come to take over. Hubris, in a word, becomes the master. Has this moment been reached? I think it is hard to say, but there is, it seems to me, a new priority that in the history of democracy has never before been faced. The question is whether it makes sense to call for the democratization of the American empire. Rephrased, if democracy means at a minimum keeping watch publicly on exercises of power and keeping hubris in check, then who shall keep watch over the leading democracy? I think this question is vital because the emerging world of post-representative democracy is now faced with this brand new challenge. Every young democracy needs the help of friends, said President Bush in an address to the UN General Assembly on the 23rd of September 2003. That's true, but the inverse also holds. Lending others a helping hand requires practicing the art of letting go. Democracy, in other words, requires the democratization of the democratizer and its war-making powers. Democracy cannot be expected to thrive in the world when the dominant power consistently exerts its dominance, behaves arrogantly, or crashes around like a frightened bull in a many-sided, fragile china shop. In a study, you may know, by John Eikenberry of post-war settlements and the rise, in particular, of the American dominant power, John Eikenberry points out something very interesting, that the major gains of American power globally have typically happened through the practice of self-restraint. Low returns to power are a vital condition of democracy, he points out. That is, self-limiting power, the democratic power to bind and restrain oneself, in a word, humility, can be a highly effective form of power. It seems to be that there is no returning to the Wilsonian doctrine that was born after World War I of a world system of independent, sovereign, territorial nation-states that are democracies that just do it by pulling themselves up through their own bootstraps, perhaps with a little help from the ill-fated League of Nations. Those times are over. Our times are much more complex. They are no longer Athenian. What, it seems to me, is now for the first time on the political agenda and the intellectual agenda in the history of democracy is the question of whether the United States could be drawn into procedures and institutions that have humbling effects and that paradoxically enable it to do things with less resistance from those who don't like its bullishness. I think major reforms, including the restructuring of the ailing United Nations, breathing life into the new International Criminal Court, declaring a moratorium on, for example, the global production and use of nuclear and biochemical weapons, none of this can be done without the United States. And so a fundamental political question of our time. Can the most powerful democracy in the world itself be democratized? Can its citizens and political leaders come to recognize, to repeat the words of Harry Truman in 1945, that no matter how great its strength, the United States must deny itself the license to do always as it pleases? Can the United States be made to see that it has a material interest in behaving itself in relation to its neighbors? Is something like a global transition to democracy possible? One that ensures that American war-making power is made less threatening, more restrained, more accessible to the opinions and the sanctions of others. Thank you very much.
Now I invite Professor over to